Hello, welcome back to the HT podcast. I'm your host, Shashank Mattoo. It's been over a year since the Trump administration took office. Now, back in 2024, Donald Trump won the presidency by winning support among a diverse group of voters, young men, Hispanic Americans, and surprisingly, Indian Americans. But a new report by the Carnegie Endowment finds that the president's support among Indian Americans is slipping. 1 in 2 respondents in America these days report discrimination on varying grounds over the last year, over 2025. And that bears what we've seen online, particularly with racist attacks against Indian Americans. And that could be particularly worrying for where America is going as a country. Joining me now to discuss what has been happening in American politics and how Indian Americans have seen what's been happening is one of the Carnegie Endowment Report's authors, senior fellow and director of the South Asia program, Milan Vaishnav. Dr. Vaishnav, thank you so much for joining us. Can you begin by setting the scene for us in terms of what your report has found? Just to begin with, Indian Americans, around 71% of Indian Americans now do not approve of Donald Trump's performance on the job. This was a group of Americans who moved quite strongly towards President Trump in 2024. Now they seem to be a little more regretful of that choice. Can you talk a little bit about that? What exactly has happened over the last year?
I think that's right. I mean, first of all, thank you for having me, Shashank. It's great to be with you. Maybe rewinding the clock a little bit further. Most of your listeners and viewers will know that Indian Americans have been decisively in favor of the Democratic Party for many years now, and there are multiple surveys, including other surveys that have been done by other outfits other than Carnegie, which has substantiated that. And the way to think about it is, in the 2020 election, which featured Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, about 70% of Indian Americans supported Joe Biden, about 20% supported Donald Trump. Fast forward 4 years, 2024 election comes around, and that 70-20 advantage that the Democrats enjoyed moved to a 60-30 advantage. So there was a 10 percentage point roughly swing towards Donald Trump in the 2024 election, right? So there was a sense that Indian Americans, at least a segment of them, had become somewhat disillusioned or disenchanted with the Democratic Party and decided to roll the dice with Donald Trump. We did this survey in December of 2025 or the first week of January 2026 with a nationally representative group of Indian Americans to try and get a sense that, we've had 12 months of the Trump administration now behind us. How are people feeling? And as you rightly pointed out, 7 out of 10 Indian Americans disapprove of the way that Donald Trump has handled his job as president in the first year of the second term. That includes large majorities who disagree with his handling of domestic economic issues, his international economic policies, including his trade policies and tariff policies, and number 3, his domestic immigration policies, right? And so this is pretty strong disapproval across the board. Now, what's interesting when you come into kind of the politics of it is that it is true that Indian Americans remain disproportionately in favor of the Democratic Party, right, but their attachment to the party has weakened. Right. So they continue to identify with the party by wide margins, but the share of Democrats has shrunk. And I would say the intensity or strength of their feeling for the Democratic Party has weakened somewhat. The Republican identifier, so those in the community who voted Republican, who feel part of the party, has not budged much. What we've seen actually is that the group of people who are independents or who can't decide whether they're with the Democrats or Republicans has also increased in turn.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about that. Let's break down the numbers a little bit, because you talked about the fact that Indian Americans seem to disapprove of President Trump's tariff policy. They disapprove of his policies on birthright citizenship, which is, to explain to our audience, the policy that if you are born on the soil of the United States, you automatically become a U.S. citizen. They also disagree with, inflation, taxes, and immigration policy, which is interesting because if you think about the 2024 election, when I was talking to Indian American voters about what they thought were the reasons why they voted for President Trump, they said, immigration was out of control and the economy wasn't doing so well. And we elected Donald Trump to deliver on those promises. But what your report finds is that 64% of Indian Americans disapprove of his immigration policy, 68% disapprove of inflation, taxes, and spending, and 70% disagree with his international economic policy, which includes tariffs, trade, and so on and so forth. That's very, very large, decisive majorities against President Trump's agenda. Can you speak a little bit about where this dissatisfaction came from? People that you've been talking to, what's the sense? What's the mood?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And our survey from 2024 shows this as well, which is when people were asked, what is the issue that is going to be decisive for you on election day? It was economic factors first and foremost, right? It was jobs, the economy. People really felt the pinch of inflation, and immigration had become a top tier issue. That this was something that had a lot of salience, and of course was a central part of Trump's plan. Right now, fast forward about a year, people do seem disappointed. In part because I think it's fair to say that there's been a lot of chaos in the first 12 months. We've seen a lot of disruption. We've seen an immigration policy that many people believe in some parts has been unlawful, that has gone to the extremes. Indians, of course, just to give you one example, have benefited enormously by the H-1B skilled worker visa program. 70% of people who come to the United States on this visa are Indian origin. The Trump administration announced a new $100,000 fee on new H-1B visa petitions, right? So that's something that seems to kind of target this one group. But similarly, I think we see a lot of people upset with the fact that people are getting deported. Immigrants are getting deported to countries that they're not even from. So it's not something to say, okay, you're from country X, we're going to send you back there because you're here illegally, but we're going to actually take you and send you to country Y, someplace where you have no family, no friends, no contacts. And so I think there's a sense, and I think the same logic can apply to the international economic side, right? Where yes, I think there was some sense that maybe America has been taken advantage of. We need to have a strong trade policy, but the way in which tariffs have been applied has been seen as scattershot, right? And if you just take the example of India for a second, I mean, here's a country that we discussed for years and years and years and described as being a core strategic part of the United States, which is now struck with some of the highest tariffs in the world, right? So I think many of the ways in which this president has executed or prosecuted his priorities has run afoul of what this community was hoping or expecting.
Right. And, one of the things that your report points out, and I found that very interesting, is that many Indian Americans also seriously disapprove of how President Trump has handled relations with India. I think in the first Trump administration back in 2020, I think 35% of Indian Americans approved of President Trump's handling of the relationship with India. Now just 20% do. But also interestingly, I was looking at another statistic where it said that relations with India are really at the bottom in terms of the list of factors that decide how Indian Americans are going to vote. They really don't care all that much about how presidents handle the relationship with India. They're much more interested in bread and butter issues like inflation, the job market, and so on and so forth. Talk a little bit about that, could you? About how much the relationship with India matters.
Sure. I would frame it slightly differently, Shashank, which is to say, I don't think it's that Indian Americans don't care about U.S.-India relations. I think actually many of them are paying attention. They're following the trajectory. Our data suggests they're not happy with the way that Trump has pursued U.S.-India policy in this first year. But when it comes to that crucial day of voting, when they're really trying to decide who they cast their ballot for, they are much more driven by day-to-day kitchen table or bread and butter issues, like, again, jobs, inflation, the price of things, employment, are there opportunities for their kids, and so on and so forth. And so in that way, I think Indian Americans are much like the general American public. I mean, this is similar to what we find in large surveys of the entire American population, is that by and large, people are really motivated when they're making that fateful decision of who to vote for, not by foreign policy or national security, although that might be important, but it tends not to be a decisive election day issue.
Right. And, I wanted to move into some specific questions that I think a lot of people have been thinking about both in India and in America. Most importantly, over the last year, if you're someone who uses a social media app, if you use X in particular, you've seen this rising tide of racist attacks against Indian Americans, oftentimes coming from influencers and political voices that are seen as close to President Trump and the Make America Great Again movement. What is your report finding about how that rising tide of racist attacks has impacted how Indian Americans see themselves, see politics, see their place in America?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, let me try to unpack various components of that. I think, as you rightly point out, we've had now enough independent research reports that have picked up that there has been a sharp anti-Indian and anti-Indian American racism on the internet, particularly on social media platforms like X. We find that about of our samples, so we interviewed 1,000 Indian Americans across the country. About half of them reported encountering these kinds of racist posts very or somewhat often, right? So I think we want to be careful about how much people are taking in of this, because not everyone in this community is a highly online person, but clearly, at least with 1 in 2 people, they're seeing this quite often. Um, when it comes to actual first-hand experiences of discrimination, we do not find a measurable increase in what people report in terms of their own experiences with discrimination. So, starting in 2020, then again in 2024, and then in 2026, we've asked the same question, which is whether in the prior 12 months, people have felt discriminated against for a list of reasons, and they can choose multiple. Is it the color of their skin? Is it maybe the way they talk? Is it their country of origin? And about 1 in 2 Indian Americans consistently over the past 6 years has felt that they have been victims of discrimination. So very little shift in the overall numbers. The primary reason or basis of discrimination, they believe, again, this is consistent for the past 6 years, is the color of their skin. But I don't want to suggest that things have not changed, because one of the other things we find in the survey is we ask people whether or how they are modifying their behavior for fear of being targeted and harassed. And I think this is really having to do with this whole question of like self-censorship, right? I mean, are you somehow holding back on activities because you're worried about being a target, right? And just to put this in perspective, 1/3 of Indian Americans say, yeah, we don't want to discuss politics or policy online because we're worried about being targeted, right? I mean, 1 in 5 people say, like, we don't even want to wear Indian dress publicly for fear that, again, we might paint a target on our back, right? So I think one of the worrying signs for us in this report is that people may be preemptively choosing to modify or shape their social and political behavior for fear of being targeted, even if they haven't personally experienced discrimination or an uptick in that discrimination.
Right. And Dr. Vaishnav, I think this is really important. At this point, I really do want to read out the numbers because I think it's extremely interesting. I thought it was one of the most interesting findings in your report, which is that you find, as you say, 31% of Indian Americans are now avoiding discussing or engaging with politics on social media. 1 in 5 Indian Americans are uncertain or trying to avoid leaving and re-entering the United States for travel. 1 in 5 of them does not want to put a political sign outside of their home or a bumper sticker on their car, which is how Americans generally show their political affiliation. Around 20% of them don't want to publicly wear Indian dress and attire, and around 18% of them are reconsidering attending a political rally or a protest. These are absolutely basic things that citizens do in a society. And I was wondering, because you're an Indian American yourself and you've seen this community evolve, we keep talking about how the Indian Americans were basically invisible 20 years ago in national politics, and now you see them everywhere. But at the same time that you have this rising representation, you also have this increasing sense that people want to avoid being seen as political because they fear that they will be discriminated against. Can you talk about that duality at the same time?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, is that there is a bit of a paradox here, right? Which is typically what happens with most immigrant communities is the first generation, which are the new immigrants born elsewhere, in this case, India, tend to not necessarily be very politically or civically engaged. They tend to keep their heads down, focus on establishing themselves, their families, their careers, their children. And it's really then the second and subsequent generations that have the freedom, frankly, and the privilege to become more politically active, thanks to the foundations that their parents or grandparents may have built. And I think what we're seeing is at precisely the time when we're seeing that generational transition really take off, more and more people are wary of engaging in the public sphere. And I think this is direct outcome of, I think, the really hateful rhetoric that we've seen in the online space that has been fanned by politicians. I mean, just think of it, no less a figure than Vivek Ramaswamy, who is the Republican candidate for governor of the state of Ohio, has been seen as a close ally of President Trump. decided to write a op-ed in the New York Times to essentially denounce the fact that Indian Americans have become a target and that his own party and people associated with the MAGA movement have been first in line essentially to single out Indian Americans. And so I think what we're seeing right now is a kind of chilling effect. And what I think is dangerous about it is it's also very hard to kind of pick up because it's really trying to capture what people aren't doing, right, as opposed to what they are doing.
Right. And I think that the one moment I think nationally and that made national headlines even in India was that moment where JD Vance made that now infamous statement where he sort of seemed to hint that he would hope that his wife, Usha Vance, who was a Hindu, would sort of start believing in the Christian gospel or maybe come to convert to Christianity. And what your report finds is that 71% of Indian Americans found that statement made them uncomfortable about Indian religious backgrounds and how they're represented in US politics. And 82% of them came out and said that, look, politicians need to be more careful about making statements about their spouse's religious beliefs. And that was, I think, one of those moments that I think just captured or became sort of this lightning rod for Indians and Indian Americans to start talking about why the vice president felt like he wanted to speak about his wife's religion in that way. Could you talk about that controversy and what that represented? Because I think it was a massive controversy both here and in India.
Yeah, I think you summarized it very well, which was this is a statement that the vice president made at a town hall, I believe it was at the University of Mississippi, in which he was asked a question about his wife's faith. Basically said that, I do hope eventually that she is moved the same thing I was moved by, which was, the Church of Christ. And I wish that because I believe in the Christian gospel, that she might come to see things the same way. And I think this went down very poorly, amongst Indian Americans because they felt that it was, again, somehow saying that there's something about being non-Christian or being Hindu that is, problematic in some way that may not be mainstream. And, I think one of the structural barriers to the Republican Party amongst Indian Americans, and this comes out very clearly in our data, is that when you ask people who don't associate with the Republican Party, meaning they either vote for the Democrats or they're independents, why is it that you choose not to associate with the Republican Party? The number one response is we fundamentally believe that this avatar of the Republican Party is intolerant of minorities, right? And I think even as the Republican Party has made some inroads in this community, I think there is going to be a ceiling if people continue to have this view that this is a party that is first and foremost for Christians, number one, and number two, this is a party that has xenophobic tendencies that is fundamentally kind of anti-immigrant and anti-minority, right? And so I think this went down very badly indeed with Indian Americans who, of course, I think we're quick to point out, the kind of hypocrisy of somebody who's married to a Hindu himself making this kind of statement.
Right. And, just to put a point on it, I think that what you found in your reports was that I think 17% of people felt that, one of the reasons they wouldn't vote for the Republicans just a couple of years ago was that they were not necessarily friendly towards minorities. That number jumped to 27%.
Yeah.
So in just a 2-year period, you have a 10% jump in people thinking that the Republican Party is unfriendly to minorities. And I was just in general, perhaps this is not in your report, but I would be interested in when you speak to Indian Americans who vote Republican, how do they square that circle? Because we have seen, people like Laura Loomer, you see them quite often coming out on Twitter and saying fairly racist things about Indian Americans. You see that a lot with people who are aligned with the Make America Great Again movement. I think there was a Texas Governor Greg Abbott lit a lamp for Diwali, and then you read the comments below his post, and they were fairly shocking. How do Indian American Republicans, and I was seeing that your report finds that they remain fairly steady in their support for the Republican Party, how do they square that circle? How do they see the party that, to many Indian Americans, does not fundamentally accept them as Americans? What's your view of that?
I mean, I think there's a couple of things to point out, right? I think one is it is certainly true that among some demographics, there has been a backlash. But let me just give you one example. What we found in 2024 when we saw a movement of about 10 percentage points away from Indian Americans, away from the Democrats or the Republicans, almost the entirety of that shift was due to Indian American men under the age of 40, principally Indian American men born in the United States. Now, that's actually a finding that others have seen, whether it's among African Americans, Hispanics, other Asians, and so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily specific. A lot of that has reversed course in just 1 year, right? So, in fact, Indian American young men have moved strongly away from the president in just 12 months. I think in part because of reflections like this. And, I just want to point out that immigration was a very salient issue for Indian Americans in the 2024 election. I mean, 28% of respondents who did not associate with the Democratic Party said it was because the party's weak on illegal immigration. I think that the trouble is people have qualms or issues with how, again, this crackdown on illegal immigration is proceeding. But coming now to the group that is harder to explain, and here I'm just going by kind of anecdotes because it's hard to determine this just through anyone's survey, is, what about those people who are staying Republican within the Indian American community? One of the things that came across in us data this time around is that people are not sure about the Democrats, right? I mean, I think this is, again, part of a national conversation where people are asking themselves, what is this party? Where's its center of gravity? Who are the leaders who are going to take the party forward towards the next presidential election? And, we're at a place where there's a real vacuum. Barack Obama has exited and left the scene. Joe Biden obviously is no longer in the public eye. Kamala Harris was seen as somebody who had her shot, couldn't live up to those expectations. And so right now there is this feeling of a kind of vacuum, right? And so sometimes in these decisions, it is kind of the devil you know versus the devil you don't. And I think right now the alternative to Trump is not so clearly defined. Now, I do expect that as we cross the midterm elections in the fall of 2026, and we start to see those presidential contenders emerge, this will start to change, right? We're at a point in the political cycle right now where the field is essentially wide open, and there's a big question mark as to what the Democratic Party is going to look like come the 2028 election.
Right. And speaking of how the Democratic Party is going to look in the future and what the alternatives to Trump are, I think we come to Zohran Mamdani. And I think one of the findings that you sort of came up with was this rising star who sort of stormed to win the Democratic Party's nomination to become mayor of New York City, and then unexpectedly won that election. Commands a lot of fairly enthusiastic support among Indian Americans. I think your report finds that roughly 70% of Indian Americans are enthusiastic about his victory. They think that it'll be good for the Indian American community. Talk to us about Zohran, because at least when you were covering the election, it did seem that there were divisions in the Indian American community about what to think about him, but people seem to be enthusiastic about him. What's the story there?
I think so. I mean, I think what's interesting there is as you say, I mean, 7 in 10 respondents were enthusiastic about his recent victory as New York City mayor, right? So there's this feeling that he clearly has this kind of political magnetism that people are drawn to. And now, of course, there is going to be a partisan divide on that, right? So, unsurprisingly, a 9 out of 10 Democrats virtually were enthusiastic of his victory. Obviously, fewer Republicans are, but here, there, too. I mean, you see actually a bit of a split. So, the percentage of Republicans who are enthusiastic versus unenthusiastic is about 45% apiece, right? So actually, that means he actually has a fair amount of support amongst Republicans as well. And I think, what's been interesting, if you just step back, and some people have written about this, is there are people in New York who are Trump Mamdani voters, right? So these are people who seem to come from the opposite end of the spectrum, but I think they share a couple of commonalities, right? I mean, they're seen as outsiders, they're seen as people who want to mix up the system. And yes, you can say he's a liberal progressive, and you can say Trump is a right conservative, but on certain issues, they're kind of independent of ideology, right? I mean, they're almost operating on a different plane, right? I mean, so one of the things I think has surprised a lot of people, Mamdani, is yes, he's wanted to bring about universal pre-K for children in New York, but he's also wanting to cut red tape for small businesses, right? That's typically a Republican priority. Similarly with Trump, the kinds of more protectionist nativist stances he's taken on trade have been typically things that have been favored by labor unions and the left, right? But essentially, he's adopted those issues which completely break with the orthodoxy of the right. So I think there is just a general feeling in the U.S., right, which is people want fighters who are not necessarily beholden to these traditional kind of left-right camps, and I think clearly Mamdani is one of those people.
Right. And I really wanted to ask you this because I think when I saw this happen, I wanted to talk to you about it. Now I get the opportunity to, which is that the way Mamdani feels as a candidate is also remarkably different from politicians in the past. And just to explain what I mean by this, there was a generation of politicians, Nikki Haley, Bobby Jindal, who were seen as having to conform to the American mainstream to be electable as Indian candidates. And when they got elected, this was, of course, a path-making moment for the community. But Zohran Mamdani feels completely different in some senses. The vibe of his campaign, the videos that he put out were very explicitly South Asian. He wasn't trying to push his sort of South Asian background to one particular side. I remember watching his acceptance speech, and he did not end with the typical refrain that you hear from American politicians, which is "God bless the United States of America." He ended his speech, and then "Dhoom Machale" starts playing in the background. So there was a way in which it felt that he owned being South Asian and coming from an Indian American or South Asian background that seems very different from how politicians used to do it 20 years ago, or what was seen as necessary to get elected 20 years ago.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think this again is a broader social cultural phenomenon in the United States and frankly in many other countries as well, which is that it seems that voters are really placing a premium on authenticity, right? That they want people who are comfortable in their own skin, who again have a particular set of values or identity traits that they stand behind. One of the criticisms often with Kamala Harris was, yes, okay, she has Indian ancestry on her mother's side, but seems to shy away from that part of her background and didn't necessarily embrace it sort of publicly, and maybe was too kind of politically kind of crafty in how she went about it, right? And I think there is this feeling now that what pays is authenticity. I mean, just to give you kind of one statistic, right? I mean, Mamdani, who is a proud Muslim, who talks about his faith, who makes no bones about it. I mean, in our survey, 60% of Indian Americans say they believe people like Mamdani are going to be good for the Hindu community, right? So
Right.
there's a sense that he has certain priorities that he's going to stand up for. And we're not necessarily going to penalize him because he's a different religion as ours, because we feel actually that his heart is in the right place.
So, Dr. Vaishnav, just one final question for you, which is that if you're Donald Trump and someone hands you this report that the Carnegie Endowment has done and says that Indian Americans are deeply dissatisfied with their performance in office, how worried is someone like Donald Trump going to be? Because there's this duality sometimes when you talk to Republicans, or I talk to them, and they say, yes, we are worried, but we also know that Indian Americans don't vote for us anyway, so it's not such a big deal. And we talk to the Democrats, and they're very interested in getting Indian American votes back. I was covering some of the campaigns here, the governor's elections that took place last year in Virginia and New Jersey. And a big part of the Democratic campaign was to win back support from the Indian Americans. But your report points out that actually Indian Americans are less interested in Trump, but they're less interested in the Democrats as well. So if you're the two main parties and you're gearing up for this big midterm battle that's going to happen in 2026 for control of the House of Representatives, control of the Senate, how are you looking at the findings that you have put in front of the public right now?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Shashank, and a tough question. I mean, I think, there's guidance, I think, for both major political parties from this report, right? I mean, on the one hand, I think clearly if you think of Indian Americans as a kind of swing vote, which, yes, okay, majority of them still themselves with the Democratic Party, but an increasing number of them have drifted towards the Republicans. They are critical enough now in several swing states or battleground states where having them on your side actually can make a difference. The fact that large majorities of them are upset with your domestic policies, your international economic policies, your immigration policies, and your handling of U.S.-India relations should kind of send the flashing red kind of alarm bells ringing, right? Where, again, I think that what Trump stood for in abstract terms in 2024, which is getting the economy back on track, dealing with illegal immigration, I think these are still things that the Americans care about. But again, I think the way in which it's been done has been sloppy. It's created a lot of collateral damage. We're speaking on a day when the Supreme Court has just struck down the use of emergency authority to have reciprocal tariffs with every country in the world. This is going to create a lot of sort of chaos in the trading system. Right? So I think there's a reflection there where, it's not as if Indian Americans are outside of the grasp of the Republicans, but they have to play their cards well. Of course, correct. When it comes to Democrats, right, I think they do, and they have had a natural advantage with Indian Americans. But I think, again, that kind of party brand has been really slipping. And I think there is an urgent need to kind of define or redefine kind of what the party stands for. And I think, again, one of the things that the Mamdani data suggests from our survey, again, is that, I think people are really looking for somebody, not necessarily with whom they agree on every single ideological position, who is forthright, who can speak truth to power, who's going to have your back, and is able to essentially break old political conventions, right? And I think that is really going to be the big question for the midterms when we start to see this presidential race shape up, is are the Democrats going to resort to kind of the lowest common denominator kind of candidate who can please everybody, or somebody who is really going to kind of catch fire? And the trouble is, it's hard to know these things in advance, right? No one would have predicted at this point, way back when, Barack Hussein Obama would have been a two-term Democratic president, right? So I think people on the Democratic side who are maybe wringing their hands and losing their sleep probably need to take a deep breath, because some of these things are going to be sorted out. Probably before the end of the year, we're going to get a better sense of where things stand.
Right. Dr. Milan Vaishnav, Director of the South Asia Program at the Carnegie Endowment, explaining to us a very important report ahead of the 2026 midterm elections of where the Indian American community sits. If you're the Democrats, as well as President Donald Trump, you're going to have to do some hard thinking about the kind of support you want to get from the Indian Americans. Dr. Vaishnav, thank you so much for joining us here on the HT podcast.
Thanks for having me.